Welcome to American Aftermath. Tonight, we'll trace the entire story of the Challenger Space Shuttle disaster. On a cold January morning in 1986, school children across America watched a teacher ride a shuttle into space and instead saw it break apart seconds after launch. All 7 astronauts were lost, and families, classmates, and colleagues were left staring at the same awful image replaying on their screens. Across the country, shock turned into hard questions about risk and trust as America halted shuttle flights and reconsidered how safe its space program really was. We'll take our time and keep an easy pace. We'll stay close to the people who lived through it and to the quiet ways this disaster still shows up in American life today. Before we begin, if you find comfort in calm retellings of the days that broke and reshaped America, you're welcome to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and at what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, settle back, and let the rest of the day drift while we ease into tonight's story. Before we stay with that cold January morning and the white plume in the sky, we need to step back for a while and sit with the years when this kind of launch was being imagined as almost routine. To understand how deeply that brief minute of flight shook Americans, we have to remember what space travel and everyday life looked like when the shuttle was sold as safe, repeatable, and woven into normal days. So for a little while, we'll drift back into the decade before, when the country was learning to see trips to orbit as just another part of ordinary life. In the early 1970s, the United States was still adjusting to the end of the moon landings and to the end of the long race with the Soviet Union. The grainy images of astronauts walking on the moon were already drifting into classroom posters and family photo albums. At the same time, the country faced inflation, political scandal, and a sense that money for giant projects might be tightening. NASA still carried enormous prestige, but it now had to argue for its future instead of assuming it. Inside the space agency, engineers and planners tried to imagine what would come after the last Apollo mission. The idea of flying farther into deep space was appealing, but harder to defend in budget hearings. A different idea began to gain strength, one that focused on turning spaceflight into a service that could be used again and again. Instead of disposable rockets that fell into the ocean after each launch, they imagined a reusable vehicle that could take off, deliver a payload, and then come back to be prepared for the next trip. This new vision eventually took the shape of the Space Shuttle. The shuttle would have a winged orbiter that looked a little like an airplane, a large external fuel tank, and 2 solid rocket boosters strapped to the sides. The orbiter would carry astronauts and cargo into orbit and then glide back to a runway landing on Earth. The tank and boosters would fall away in flight, but much of the system would be recovered and used again. In drawings and promotional films, it looked sleek, modern, and practical, like something from a near future that was finally arriving. For NASA leaders, the shuttle idea offered more than technology. It offered a way to promise both savings and usefulness to many parts of the government. The shuttle was presented as a way to launch scientific satellites, military payloads, and commercial communications equipment. It could, in theory, do the work of several older rocket families at a lower cost per flight. It would also keep skilled workers in places like Houston, Huntsville, and the Cape from being scattered after Apollo ended. In that sense, the shuttle was as much a jobs and policy program as a scientific one. In the wider country, the mood towards science and technology was mixed, but often hopeful. Personal computers were still rare, but electronics were becoming smaller and more common in homes and offices. Air travel had become a familiar experience rather than a glamorous rarity. Many Americans had grown up watching rockets rise from Florida on television and were now raising their own children with those memories. The idea that spaceflight itself might become more like air travel felt natural to many people who had lived through the early jet age. The Challenger disaster belonged to a shuttle era that was pitched as a bridge between the drama of the moon race and a more settled age of space work. When the program was sold to lawmakers, advocates spoke about launching once a week or at least several times each month. They used phrases like space transportation system to suggest something stable, scheduled, and almost ordinary. The shuttle would carry laboratory modules, telescopes, and even large pieces of future space stations. It might also bring commercial customers who could not afford entire rocket programs of their own. In classrooms, teachers folded the shuttle into lessons about science and math. Textbooks showed diagrams of the orbiter, the fuel tank, and the boosters. Children learned the names of new launch pads and new mission control rooms. They colored pictures of astronauts floating in a shuttle cabin, while Earth curved in a blue band behind them. For many children, the shuttle became the image of spaceflight itself, a replacement for the sharp-pointed rockets of the previous generation. Within NASA, the practical work of turning drawings into a flying vehicle moved through the 1970s. Engineers had to balance reliability, weight, and cost for every major system. They chose ceramic tiles to shield the orbiter from the heat of re-entry, knowing that each tile would need careful inspection after every flight. They worked through designs for the main engines, which would become some of the most complex power plants ever placed on a rocket. They also relied on solid rocket boosters on the sides, large casings filled with solid fuel, which would fire from the pad and then fall into the ocean to be recovered and reused. The path from idea to hardware involved constant trade-offs. NASA faced pressure to reduce the cost of development and to share the shuttle with other agencies. The Air Force wanted certain capabilities, including the ability to carry heavy payloads and to land on long runways at Western bases. To meet those needs, planners accepted design compromises, such as a larger, heavier orbiter and certain structural choices that would later shape the shuttle's risk profile. Each compromise felt manageable at the time, another adjustment in a long list of engineering decisions. Politically, the shuttle became a symbol that presidents and lawmakers could point to as proof that the United States was still leading in space. President Nixon's administration approved the program, and later administrations continued to fund it, even as other projects were delayed or cancelled. The story told to the public was one of continuity and reassurance. America would not stop going to space. It would simply go in a new way, with vehicles that came back for refurbishment instead of being thrown away. That story was powerful in an era when many other national institutions seemed to be under strain. By the time the first shuttle, Columbia, flew in 1981, the country had already spent years watching artists' impressions and test vehicles. The first flight brought back some of the tension and drama of earlier launches, with people gathered around televisions and radios again. When Columbia landed safely on a California runway, it seemed to prove that the basic idea worked. Over the next few years, additional orbiters joined the fleet, including Challenger. Launches became more frequent. Some flights carried scientific laboratories, while others deployed satellites that would later bring cable television and new communication services. As flights increased, NASA and the public began to treat shuttle missions as more routine. News coverage still appeared, but not every mission led the evening broadcast. For engineers and controllers, the sense of risk never completely vanished, yet the steady pattern of launches and landings made success feel normal. At schools and in living rooms, parents might mention a launch in passing, rather than planning their day around it. The shuttle seemed to be doing what its designers had promised, turning access to orbit from a rare spectacle into a regular service. This atmosphere of growing normality shaped the background of the Challenger disaster long before the specific mission was scheduled. When a system performs well again and again, people often begin to see its risks through the lens of past success. Small technical issues can be folded into categories of expected difficulty rather than treated as fresh warnings. Within NASA, certain problems were tracked, discussed, and managed, yet they lived inside a culture that had learned to live with known imperfections. The shuttle flew, it returned, and work continued. At the same time, the shuttle program was carrying more than machines. Astronauts came from a wider range of backgrounds than the early test pilots of Mercury and Apollo. There were scientists, medical doctors, engineers, and eventually a teacher who would later be assigned to fly on Challenger. The astronaut corps visited schools, spoke with civic groups, and appeared on talk shows. They described the shuttle in plain language and invited people to imagine themselves participating in spaceflight in some indirect but meaningful way. The gap between ordinary life and orbit felt smaller than it had during the moon race. Economically, the shuttle era grew alongside changes in American life that could make space seem both distant and intertwined with daily routines. Satellite communications began to carry television signals and phone calls. Weather satellites provided images that appeared on local news broadcasts. Some of those satellites had been launched or serviced by shuttle crews. When viewers saw a forecast map, they were sometimes looking at data made possible by flights that had begun on the same Florida coast, where tourists watched launches from the beach. The Challenger disaster would later reveal how fragile that sense of normality had been. But in the years before 1986, confidence in the shuttle ran deep. Schedules were crowded, and NASA spoke about building toward a steady rhythm of missions. The agency trained crews back to back, prepared payloads for commercial and military customers, and planned more ambitious uses of the shuttle as an orbital workshop. There was talk of carrying modules for a future space station and of performing complex repairs in orbit. Each success made the next plan seem reasonable. In homes across the country, people who had been children during Apollo were now parents themselves. They might tell their children where they had been when they watched the first moon landing, and then point to the shuttle on the evening news. Teachers used the shuttle to connect lessons about physics, engineering, and teamwork. Companies produced toys and model kits, letting children hold small plastic versions of the orbiter in their hands. Space was still far away, but its symbols rested on bedroom shelves and classroom windowsills. All of these currents, from policy debates in Washington to drawings in school notebooks, flowed together into the world in which the Challenger disaster would eventually occur. The shuttle was seen as both a tool and a symbol, something that tied together national pride, scientific ambition, and a belief that complex systems could be made reliable through careful work. As the program moved into the mid-1980s, the promise of that reliability would be tested by cold air, aging parts, and human decisions that did not yet feel as consequential as they would soon become. In the years and flights leading up to the Challenger disaster, a small rubber ring inside the shuttle's solid rocket boosters quietly became one of the most fragile parts of the whole system. Each booster was made from stacked steel segments that joined together with circular gaps, and those gaps were supposed to be sealed by flexible O-rings that would press tight when the motor lit. The O-rings were only a few centimeters across in thickness, but they sat between burning propellant and the thin line of metal that held the shuttle and its crew. NASA managers and engineers knew that if these seals failed, the hot gas could escape through a joint, cut into nearby structures, and cost the vehicle and its people their lives. Yet over time, as flight after flight seemed to succeed, signs that the O-rings were wearing, charring, or letting soot slip past were treated as problems to be managed instead of warnings that the basic joint design might be deeply unsafe for the shuttle. At Mourning Thiokol in Utah, the company that built the booster motors for the Challenger disaster era, the solid rocket design had begun as a compromise among cost, manufacturability, and performance. The boosters were built in segments so they could travel by rail from the plant to the launch site, which meant each segment ended in a complicated field joint with metal clevis and tang pieces that fit together like parts of a giant pipe. Inside that joint, engineers placed two rubber O-rings in grooves, a primary and a secondary seal, with a layer of putty and insulation nearby to keep the heat at bay. When the booster lit, pressure inside the motor was supposed to squeeze the metal parts together, trap high-pressure air against the primary O-ring, and push the rubber firmly into place before any hot gas could find a path through the gap. On paper, this double seal was meant to provide redundancy so that even if one ring failed, the other would still protect everything. In the first shuttle years before the Challenger disaster, that neat design began to show small but worrying flaws. After an early flight, inspectors at Kennedy and engineers back in Utah found that the primary O-ring in one joint had been scorched, with a shallow groove burned into the rubber where hot gas had eaten away at the seal. Later inspections revealed occasions when soot had passed entirely beyond the primary ring and left dark traces between the primary and secondary seals, proof that for at least a moment the first barrier had not done its job. Each time the booster had still held together, and each time the mission had landed safely. So the visible damage was written up, debated, and then folded into a growing list of known but accepted problems. In meeting rooms, the charts Shah Asmis howled erosion in fractions of an inch, and the argument was that the ring still had enough material to seal. Over time, that logic turned real alarms into routine statistics for managers. For the people closest to the hardware in the years before the Challenger disaster, those statistics did not feel routine at all. At the Mourning Thiokol plant in Utah, engineers like Roger Boisjoli studied photographs of each recovered joint, measuring the depth of erosion in careful increments and comparing one flight to another. He and a small group of colleagues kept noticing patterns that pointed toward a deeper problem, including a tendency for the erosion to be worse when the metal casings had flexed more during ignition. They worried that when the booster lit, the joint could briefly open like a tiny crack, leaving a gap that the sluggish O-ring might not seal in time if the rubber had been chilled and stiffened by cold air on the pad. From their perspective, every sign of soot and sea harring was not just a blemish on a report, but evidence that fire had already slipped past the first barrier, separating the shuttle from a catastrophic loss of control in future flights ahead. Within NASA's paperwork for the era of the Challenger disaster, the booster joint O-rings appeared on a list of critical items whose failure could destroy the vehicle and take lives. For a time, they were labeled as a redundant system, a category known inside the program as Criticality 1R, because there were two rings, and it was assumed that one would back up the other if something went wrong. By the early 1980s, analysis showed that joint rotation during ignition could prevent the secondary ring from moving into place quickly, which meant it might never seal if the primary ring failed. The classification was changed to Criticality 1, a stark admission that there was now effectively a single line of defense, yet the boosters continued to fly, while managers looked for ways to control the RIC without halting launches. In practice, that meant people were accepting a known possibility of catastrophic joint failure every time they signed the paperwork that cleared a mission for launch from Florida or California. Flight history in the months before the Challenger disaster added another layer of concern, especially around cold weather. In January 1985, a shuttle mission lifted off on what was then the chilliest launch day so far, with air in the low 60s and calculated O-ring temperatures down near the low 50s. After landing, inspectors found erosion in the primary rings of both boosters and more blackened material than ever before, clear evidence that the seals had taken longer to seat while hot gas pressed against them. Engineers at Thiokol studied the data and concluded that low temperature made the rubber less flexible, slowed its motion into the sealing position, and increased the time during which gas could escape through the joint before it finally closed. In their view, cold, soaked hardware on the launch pad could leave the rings so stiff that ignition forces would open the joint faster than the rubber could respond, turning the very start of a mission into the moment of greatest danger for everyone aboard. As the Challenger disaster approached on the calendar, warnings grew more urgent in written form. In mid-1985, Roger Boisjoli wrote a detailed memo to his superiors at Mourning, Thiokol, describing the joint problem as a path to possible catastrophic failure of the shuttle and its crew, an unusually sharp phrase in a technical office. He argued that the seal could be breached during ignition, that hot gas could cut through the joint, and that the result could be the loss of the vehicle in a single flight. Along with colleagues, he helped develop a proposed redesign that added a metal lip to limit how much the joint could open, increased the thickness of the O-ring, and adjusted the insulation so the rubber would be better shielded from the cold before launch. The concept was promising, and new CC acings were ordered, but until they arrived, the shuttle would keep flying with the old joints and the same unresolved danger. Everyone involved understood that a serious joint failure could be fatal. Across the same period leading into the Challenger disaster, NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama and Mourning Thiokol in Utah were under pressure to keep launches moving. The shuttle program had been sold on a high flight rate that would carry satellites, laboratories, and special missions such as the Teacher in Space project, and each delay rippled through a long calendar of commitments. Managers at different levels knew about the joint erosion and the concerns over cold weather, yet they also faced constant reminders of budgets, national expectations, and the desire to prove that the shuttle could operate like a reliable transport system. Inside this tension, patterns of decision-making began to favor arguments that supported flying, especially when previous flights with damaged O-rings had still ended in safe landings. If a seal eroded yet held, that outcome was sometimes used as proof that the joint could tolerate more damage, rather than as a warning that the system had come closer to its limit than anyone intended to see. By the winter leading directly to the Challenger disaster, the question of temperature and O-ring performance had become a recurring topic in technical meetings. Engineers brought charts to briefings showing how the worst erosion had occurred on colder days, and how the safest flights for the joints had taken place when the hardware was warmer. Some managers pushed back, asking for more data, more statistics, and more formal proof that low temperatures truly made the joint unsafe to fly. The people who voiced concern often spoke from long experience and a steady unease, but their language of intuition and risk sometimes collided with a culture that expected clear numbers before it would change course. In long teleconferences and review boards, the discussion could narrow to whether there had ever been a joint that actually failed, and because no disaster had yet occurred, that narrow question made it harder for cautious voices to prevail. The absence of a past tragedy was treated as evidence that the margins were still wide enough. All of this meant that on the eve of the Challenger disaster, The O-ring problem was both familiar and unresolved. The joint design, the pattern of erosion, the evidence about cold weather, and the unfinished plans for redesign were known to engineers and managers across Thiokol and NASA. What had not yet happened was a final, shared decision to treat the risk as intolerable, to stop flying until the hardware changed, even if that meant empty launch pads and difficult conversations with customers. As the next mission's boosters were stacked in Florida and the winter air around the launch site grew colder, the stage was quietly set for a day when those black rubber rings would be asked to perform at the very edge of what they could safely do. In that quiet gap between recognition and action, between knowing the weakness and truly halting for it, the shuttle program moved forward toward a cold January morning when every earlier choice about the joints would suddenly matter all at once. During the months before the Challenger disaster, the teacher in space idea turned one shuttle mission into a classroom event for the whole country. Officials in Washington and at NASA hoped that inviting a regular school teacher onto a shuttle crew would remind Americans that spaceflight was not just a distant technical project, but part of everyday life. They imagined students wheeling televisions to the front of classrooms, watching a teacher float in weightlessness and seeing their own subjects come alive in orbit. In that vision, space would no longer belong only to military pilots and test crews, but to the same people who graded homework, ran bake sales, and stood at chalkboards across the United States. The idea that helped shape the Challenger disaster grew formally into the Teacher in Space project in 1984, when the Reagan administration and NASA announced that a classroom teacher would become the first private citizen to travel on the shuttle. Leaders talked about honoring educators, inspiring children, and opening a path for other professionals to follow, including artists, journalists, and ordinary workers whose lives did not revolve around rockets or laboratories. It was a way to say that the shuttle program belonged to the whole nation, not just to a small circle of engineers, officers, and astronauts who moved between Houston and the Cape. When applications opened in the year before the Challenger disaster, tens of thousands of teachers from across the United States filled out forms, wrote essays, and asked colleagues to sign recommendations. Some worked late in empty classrooms, typing at metal desks under buzzing fluorescent lights after their students had gone home. They described field trips they had led, science fairs they had organized, and the ways they tried to make distant places and ideas feel real for children who might never leave their hometowns. For many, simply imagining a colleague in a blue jumpsuit floating above Earth felt like a reward for all the quiet work that happened inside American schools each day. As the Challenger disaster mission slowly took shape on paper, committees sifted through the mountain of applications and narrowed the field first to a group of 114 semi-finalists, then to 10 finalists who were invited to Houston. Those 10 teachers came from different regions and backgrounds, carrying stories from inner-city schools, rural districts, and suburbs, and suddenly found themselves walking past mission patches and control room doors they had only ever seen on television. In meeting rooms at Johnson Space Center, They answered questions about their teaching, their health, and their ability to handle the pressures of training, while doctors, psychologists, and NASA officials listened and took notes. Outside those rooms, they shared meals, laughed nervously, and Dee tried to imagine how it would feel to tell their students that they might be the one chosen to ride a shuttle into orbit. In July 1985, the selection that would tie directly into the Challenger disaster was announced, and a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, named Krista McAuliffe, was introduced as the primary teacher in space. Barbara Morgan, an elementary school teacher from Idaho, was named as her backup, ready to train alongside her and step in if anything prevented Krista from flying. Krista taught at Concord High School, where her students knew her as energetic and informal, someone who liked to connect history and civics to current events and to the lives they were living in a small New England city. She talked about herself as a regular person, joked about grading papers in space, and kept telling reporters that she wanted to bring the curiosity and questions of her students into orbit. Once Krista became linked with the Challenger disaster mission, the shuttle turned from a technical story into a human one that local and national media could easily follow. She appeared on talk shows, answered questions at press conferences, and stood beside astronauts in blue flight suits while photographers called her name and asked her to look their way. Reporters visited Concord High School, film students working in crowded hallways and classrooms, and asked teenagers how it felt to have their own teacher preparing to leave Earth. Parents watched from the edges of parking lots or from living room sofas as she spoke into microphones about carrying lesson plans, personal mementos, and the hopes of children who had written letters and drawn pictures of the shuttle at Johnson Space Center, far from the classrooms that would later remember the Challenger disaster. Krista joined the rest of the STS-51L crew for months of training. Commander Francis Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, and Judith Resnick, and payload specialist Gregory Jarvis were already used to simulators, technical briefings, and long days moving between mock-ups and meeting rooms. Krista learned to strap into a shuttle seat, operate cameras, handle emergency equipment, and move carefully in a weightless cabin without drifting into sensors or delicate instruments. In group photos from that period, she smiles among them in the same blue uniform, a civilian teacher standing comfortably alongside people whose careers had been built around GHT and engineering. The flight plan that would later share a date with the Challenger disaster included time for Krista to teach a series of short lessons from orbit, recorded on video for later use in classrooms. She and educational planners designed activities that could show basic principles of science in a vivid way, like how fluids move without gravity, how objects fall inside the shuttle, and how everyday tools behave when they are no longer pulled down by their own weight. She planned to talk directly to students watching on television, using simple language and experiments built from familiar items such as balloons, yo-yos, and small containers of water. Lesson titles like The Ultimate Field Trip and Space as a Place would later feel poignant because they showed just how much the mission was Mente's connect orbit to ordinary school days. Across the country in the months leading up to the Challenger disaster, classroom bulletin boards filled with articles about Krista and the shuttle, often trimmed from local newspapers and pinned beside hand-drawn pictures of the orbiter. Teachers used the mission to spark discussions about space history, science careers, and the ways new technology could change daily life. And they invited students to imagine what they would do if they could join a trip above the atmosphere. NASA produced brochures, posters, and educational packets that described the crew, the shuttle systems, and the planned experiments. And these materials traveled in cardboard boxes to school offices and science departments. For students who were used to seeing space only in textbooks, the idea that a teacher would so on cool down from orbit and address them felt almost like a promise that their own world could open wider. Because the Challenger disaster flight carried the teacher in space, NASA and the networks planned more classroom coverage than usual, even though many shuttle launches by then barely appeared on live national broadcasts. Local stations arranged to carry the liftoff into the school day. Cable channels scheduled special segments, and NASA's own satellite feed would reach districts that had invested in new dishes and televisions. In some cities, administrators sent memos encouraging teachers to tune in for at least the first minutes of the launch so that students could see the teacher they had been reading about finally leave Earth. In others, schools quietly prepared televisions on rolling metal carts and kept them near the doors, planning to pull them into rooms. Once attendance was taken, Mourning announcements were done. Back in New Hampshire, as the Challenger disaster date approached, Krista's family and community moved through a mix of pride and worry that felt both ordinary and enormous. Her husband Steve continued his own work while helping care for their 2 children, and neighbors stopped him in parking lots and grocery stores to ask how everyone was holding up. At Concord High School, fellow teachers handled extra duties and made plans to cover classes while Krista was away, even as they taped up more articles and tried to keep the school day feeling calm. Local reporters interviewed her students, who talked about missing her, but also about seeing her on television. And some families arranged trips to Florida so they could watch the launch from the causeway near the Cape. As the launch window for the Challenger disaster neared in January 1986, the crew's days grew more tightly scheduled, filled with simulations, technical reviews, and final medical checks. They practiced emergency procedures in mock-up cabins, rode in training aircraft to feel brief stretches of weightlessness, and sat through detailed presentations on weather, navigation, and the payloads they would carry. Krista reviewed her lesson scripts, adjusted them based on advice from both astronauts and educators, and tried them out in front of cameras so that technicians could plan angles and lighting. In the evenings, the crew sometimes met informally, talking about families, hobbies, and past missions. And those conversations helped settle nerves and remind everyone that they were a team, rather than a set of separate assignments. Around Cape Canaveral in the days just before the Challenger disaster, hotel parking lots filled with cars from distant states, their rear windows taped with hand-lettered signs cheering on the teacher and the crew. Vendors set up stands near viewing areas, selling buttons, hats, and small shuttle toys, while families scouted good spots along the river with binoculars and cameras hanging from their shoulders. Some visitors had seen earlier launches and spoke about the ground shaking and the bright column of flame, while others had never been to Florida before and were surprised by the humidity, the flat land, and the long, straight causeways. Inside the crew quarters on the Cape, the people tied to the Challenger disaster tried to keep their routines steady. They reviewed checklists, spoke quietly with technicians, and made short phone calls to family members who were already in Florida or watching from home. Outside, forecasts mentioned unusual cold, and managers weighed concerns that would soon matter much more than before. In the days just before the Challenger disaster in late January 1986, cold air settled over Florida while a much-delayed shuttle mission waited on the pad. Launch dates had slipped again and again for reasons that sounded technical and ordinary to people far from the coast. Inside NASA and its contractors, the delays felt less ordinary because every change in schedule tightened pressure on managers who had promised that the shuttle could keep up with a heavy calendar. By the time the crew prepared once more to try for launch, the mission had become both a symbol of routine success and a test of how much strain that routine could carry. Well before the morning chosen for the Challenger disaster launch, this mission had already been pushed back by weather fronts, minor equipment glitches, and conflicts with other payloads. Each delay forced controllers to reshuffle tanks of liquid fuel, rebook tracking stations, and adjust the plans of the customers whose satellites were riding in the payload bay. On paper, those changes looked like routine scheduling work, thick with acronyms and timetable charts, yet behind them sat a feeling that this high-profile flight needed to get off the ground soon. In the control centers and offices where launch dates were argued over, the shuttle program was already carrying the weight of political promises, commercial expectations, and schoolroom hopes. Weather had always been part of launch life, but the conditions that gathered before the Challenger disaster were unusual for Florida, especially along the exposed coast around Cape Canaveral. A strong cold wave sank deep into the southeastern United States, bringing hard freezes to citrus groves and frost to highways that were more used to humid heat. Forecasters at the Cape watched the numbers fall, recording overnight lows that dipped well below the temperatures seen on any previous shuttle launch morning. Outside on the pad, wind cut around the tall metal structures and left rime on railings and hoses, turning familiar walkways into slick, glittering paths under the floodlights. As the night before the Challenger disaster drew on, technicians and managers at Kennedy Space Center sent ice inspection teams out to the pad to see how badly the cold had coated the structure. They found icicles hanging from railings and platforms, frost crusting the launch tower, and a skin of ice clinging to some of the pipes that carried water and other fluids. The worry was not only about whether hoses or valves might be damaged, but also about what chunks of ice could do if they broke free during liftoff and slammed into the side of the orbiter. In overnight meetings, experts debated charts that tried to measure the risk from ice as falling debris. while others looked at forecasts that hinted the day would grow warmer once the sun cleared the horizon. At the same time, in the hours that led directly to the Challenger disaster, another set of concerns focused on the solid rocket booster joints and their O-rings, which had already shown signs of distress in cold weather on earlier flights. In Utah, Morton Thiokol engineers studied the forecast temperatures for the Mourning launch and compared them to a history of O-ring erosion, noticing that the worst damage had happened at the lowest past temperatures. They believed the rubber would be too stiff to seal quickly if the metal around it had been chilled for hours, and that ignition could open a tiny gap in the joint faster than the O-ring could move. On the evening before launch, Thiokol and NASA connected by telephone conference so that the engineers could present their data and make a recommendation about whether the boosters were safe to fly in such deep cold. In that crucial call before the Challenger disaster, the Thiokol engineers argued strongly against launching, pointing to charts that linked lower temperatures with greater O-ring damage and warning that the forecast was colder than anything seen in previous flights. They suggested that the launch should wait until the hardware had a chance to warm, even if that meant another day of delay and more disruption to the schedule that managers in both organizations were trying to protect. For a time, the recommendation on the table was clear, with Thiokol formally advising that the boosters not be launched below a specific range of temperatures that the coming morning would almost certainly fall under. NASA managers at Marshall and at the Cape questioned the data, pressed for more proof, and asked Ed whether the pattern might be explained by other factors, such as differences in manufacturing or inspection. As the discussion grew more tense on the night before the Challenger disaster, Thiokol managers called for a private caucus, putting NASA temporarily on hold while they spoke among themselves about what to recommend. In that internal meeting, engineers continued to voice concern, repeating that they could not prove the joints would seal in the record cold, and arguing that the burden should rest with those who wanted to fly. Management, facing pressure over schedules and relationships with NASA, eventually leaned toward a different view, noting that the system had flown several times with some erosion and that no joint had yet failed outright. The final recommendation that went back on the line to NASA reversed the earlier caution, stating that Thiokol now believed the booster joints were acceptable for launch, a shift that left some engineers deeply uneasy. For NASA managers who would later live with the memory of the Challenger disaster, the written support from Thiokol carried great weight because it allowed them to tell themselves that the hardware supplier had agreed the risk was manageable. They framed the situation in terms of past experience, noting that the O-rings had been damaged yet had never let a joint open far enough to cause serious structural harm, and trusted that the coming flight would be no different. The absence of a previous disaster did not prove the system safe, but in the culture that had grown around the shuttle, repeated success had begun to feel like a kind of evidence, even when data points were few and warning signs existed. By the time the conference ended, the official record showed the solid rocket boosters CL geared for the cold morning ahead, and preparations on the pad continued according to the launch sequence that had already been delayed so many times. When the morning that would bring the Challenger disaster finally arrived, the air along the coast felt more like New England than central Florida, with frost on car roofs and thin ice on shallow puddles near the roads. Inside the crew quarters, the 7 people assigned to the mission woke to their usual launch day routines, dressing, eating light breakfasts, and joking quietly with support staff who were bundled in heavier jackets than usual. As they rode the van out to the pad, they passed patches of white on the grass that made it clear how cold the night had been, even in a state better known for palm trees and warm sand. On the steel structures of the launch complex, ice was still visible in places, and the ice inspection team made one more set of rounds, clearing some buildup and reporting back with observations that blended caution and reassurance. In schools across the country on the morning tied to the Challenger disaster, teachers rolled television sets to the front of classrooms for the 2nd or 3rd time, hoping that this attempt would finally bring the launch they had promised their students. Some children had grown restless with the earlier delays, asking whether the shuttle would really go, while others treated the repeated countdowns as small celebrations that briefly broke the normal routine of math worksheets and spelling drills. In Concord, New Hampshire, Krista McAuliffe's own students watched from their school, knowing that the tiny figure they might glimpse on the screen in a white pressure suit was the same person who had once stood beside their desks. Across time zones and school districts, the mission felt woven into the day's schedule, a live event that would take only a few minutes from attendance and lessons, yet might leave a deeper mark on memory. Back at Kennedy on the day of the Challenger disaster launch, managers held more meetings to review ice photographs and weather readings, trying to decide whether the temperatures and the remaining buildup were within the rules that governed flight. They listened to the ice team, which described brittle patches that might fall away during ignition, and to other specialists who believed that the warming trend after sunrise would reduce the danger by the time the shuttle cleared the tower. Concerns about damage to the orbiter's thermal tiles and to other delicate surfaces were weighed against the desire to avoid yet another scrub. And in the end, the judgment was that the risk from ice was acceptable. Those conclusions joined with the earlier decision about the boosters to create a final picture in which the mission appeared difficult, yet still within bounds, at least on the charts that guided Launch Authority. Once the launch decision for the Challenger disaster mission was locked in, the crew rode the elevator to the access arm, walked the short enclosed bridge to the orbiter's hatch, and began strapping into their seats. Technicians helped them settle, tethering checklists, tightening harnesses, and sealing helmets, while outside the sky brightened from grey to pale blue, and the ground crews continued to work among the cables and fuel lines below. Inside the cabin, the noise and bustle faded once the hatch was closed, leaving mostly the quiet sounds of fans, suit ventilation, and radio checks as the countdown rolled through its planned holds. For the crew members who had flown before, much of this felt familiar, a pattern of waiting, listening, and watching gauges. While for Krista, the details were new, yet layered over months of practice that had taught her what to expect. Outside, as the final minutes before the Challenger disaster launch ticked away, controllers in the firing room worked through their last checklists and listened for any voice willing to call a halt. None came, and the countdown resumed from its planned hold, with the public address announcements describing each step in calm, practiced tones that sounded like countless launches before. Far below, in homes and classrooms, viewers leaned closer to their screens as the count reached single digits, sensing only excitement and trust there. The Challenger disaster on January 28, 1986, unfolded over 73 seconds from liftoff at Cape Canaveral, while millions of Americans watched on live television from home, schools, and offices. Outside the launch complex, a clear, cold sky arched over the Atlantic, and the tall stack of boosters, tank, and orbiter stood rimmed with frost that still clung to railings and cables. Inside the vehicle, 7 people lay on their backs in bright pressure suits, listening to the measured voices of controllers and the soft rattle of pumps and fans as the final seconds of the count slipped away. In classrooms across the country, children leaned toward televisions, expecting bright flame white smoke, and then a shuttle rising safely into the blue. At the instant the shuttle moved from waiting to motion, the countdown clock rolled through its last numbers, and the familiar cadence of launch chatter steadied the nerves of people on headsets around the world. In the firing room, rows of consoles glowed with green and amber lights, while specialists watched pressures, temperatures, and valve positions, and listened for any hint that a system might be drifting from its proper line. At Mission Control in Houston, controllers monitored their own streams of data from the shuttle ready to take over once the vehicle cleared the tower and the Florida team handed responsibility to the Texas room. In living rooms, families fell quiet as the final seconds were counted aloud across the television speakers that morning. When the main engines lit, the base of the stack bloomed with bright white plumes that splashed sideways across the pad as pumps pushed chilled propellant through the huge power heads beneath the orbiter. For a brief moment, the shuttle seemed to bow against its metal supports held in place, while computers checked that each engine had reached the proper thrust and that the system remained stable enough to continue. Then, the solid rocket boosters ignited in a rush of light that turned the lower pad into a churning cloud, and the hold-down bolts released so that the entire vehicle began to rise. Flame and smoke poured outward along the flame trench as the stack cleared the tower and the shuttle tilted toward the sea. From the causeway near the Cape, people watching the launch leaned into the cold air as the bright column of fire carried the shuttle up and away above the marsh and low islands. The sound reached them a few moments later, a rolling crackle that shook car windows and rumbled through chests like distant thunder, while camera shutters clicked and small children clapped or covered their ears. In classrooms, the roar arrived only as a muffled hiss from television speakers, but the sight of the booster plume stretching down toward the ocean still drew gasps and quiet cheers from rows of students. In the first seconds of flight, everything looked like earlier launches, a spear of flame with a white vehicle riding cleanly above it. Inside the cabin, the crew rode the vibration of ascent, while gauges winked on their panels, and the sky outside the small windows shifted from pale morning blue to a deeper tone as the shuttle climbed. Commander Francis Scobie and pilot Michael Smith kept hands near the controls, listening to call-outs from the ground, while the other crew members monitored checklists, cameras, and experimental equipment strapped around the middeck and flight deck. Training said that these first moments demanded focus, yet some veterans still found a sliver of wonder in the sight of the curved horizon and in the realization that the stack was truly leaving Earth again. Krista McAuliffe lay strapped in behind them, feeling the force of launch press steadily through her seat. On ground loops, heard by the crew and by many television viewers, the familiar ascent calls marked each passing milestone as Challenger accelerated through the lower atmosphere. Controllers announced the shuttle had rolled to its programmed course and confirmed that all three main engines were performing within limits, while the solid boosters continued their powerful, steady push from either side of the external tank. As air pressure thickened around the climbing vehicle, the engines throttled back to ease the strain, then were commanded to increase thrust again once the shuttle passed the point of maximum dynamic pressure that engineers called Max Q. Moments later, the call came from the ground for go at throttle up, a phrase that signaled normal performance after that stress today. On video taken from the ground and studied later after the Challenger disaster, investigators saw that a faint tongue of flame had begun leaking from a joint on the right solid rocket booster. In the moment itself, no one in the crew or on the voice loops knew that the cold stiffened O-ring seal at that joint had failed to protect the metal casing as planned. For several seconds, the flame stayed small, pressed against the side of the booster, as exhaust gases escaped through the opening. Then it grew and began to wash against the nearby surface of the external tank. Within that brief span, the leak cut into protective structures and weakened attachments that held the booster and tank firmly together there. 73 seconds after liftoff, a sudden bright flare appeared near the top of the rising plume, and the smooth line of ascent broke into a ragged, billowing shape that spread across the winter sky. From a distance, it looked at first like a large blossom forming around the vehicle. Then the white trails of the boosters separated and began to twist away in curling paths, no longer aligned neatly with the main thrust. In the firing room and in mission control, voice tones stayed calm for a few heartbeats more as controllers tried to understand whether the strange cloud they were seeing meant a catastrophic failure or some unfamiliar but survivable event. Television viewers saw the same cloud without any guiding explanation yet given. Audio recordings later revealed that the crew answered the go at throttle up call in steady voices, and that only seconds remained between that exchange and the moment when the vehicle began to break apart. Inside Mission Control in Houston, controllers watched their streams of numbers as altitude, velocity, and engine performance readouts suddenly froze or dropped away, leaving scattered data that did not yet tell a clear story. The voice of the booster engineer came through first, speaking rapidly about a possible explosion. Then there was crosstalk as others tried to reconcile the pictures on their monitors with the figures in front of them. For a time, Official commentary on the public broadcast faltered, then resumed with careful phrases about an apparent anomaly. In classrooms that had fallen almost silent during ascent, the change in the television image arrived without warning. One moment, a rising plume. The next, a spreading cloud with white trails curling outward in several directions. Some teachers thought at first that they were seeing the planned separation of the boosters and tried to reassure students that the unusual shape was expected, even as they felt their own uncertainty grow. In Concord and in many other towns, children looked from the screen to the adults in the rooms, searching their faces for clues about whether what they had just witnessed was success or disaster. The broadcast offered no answer, so some teachers switched the screens off while others left them on in stunned silence there. On the causeway and along nearby roads, people watching in person saw small glowing fragments arc away from the growing cloud, and a few realized almost at once that the shuttle itself was no longer visible. Some shouted or pointed, while others simply stared, unable to process how quickly the scene had changed from a clean ascending line to a confused pattern of smoke and curling trails across the sky. Parents pulled children close and tried to decide whether to keep looking or to shield young eyes, even though there was nothing graphic on the horizon, only the terrible absence of the vehicle that should have been there. Along the river car, alarms and distant shouts faded as a heavy quiet settled over the crowd. In the seconds after loss of signal on that January morning flight, controllers at the Cape and in Houston followed script and training by locking their attention on procedures rather than on the growing ache in their stomachs. Supervisors ordered doors closed and communications preserved so that data could be reviewed and the exact timing of each failure understood later, even as many individuals already guessed that the crew could not have survived such a breakup. Rescue forces at sea and on nearby fields were put on alert, and helicopters began moving toward the broad area beneath the spreading cloud, marking off search zones in the chilly air above the Atlantic. They did not yet know what they would find on the waves below there. In network studios, far from Florida, producers quickly broke into regular programming and replaced scheduled shows with special reports that looped the launch footage again and again, searching for the moment when everything changed. Commentators spoke in hushed tones to match the images on the screen, explaining that communications with the shuttle had been lost and that debris was falling into the ocean off the Florida coast. Viewers who had tuned in mainly to watch the teacher in space found themselves staring at slow-motion replays that showed how quickly the bright line of ascent had dissolved into an oddly shaped cloud. In homes, the sound stayed low, while people called relatives or friends, repeating the news that the shuttle seemed to have been lost. In the hours that followed those 73 seconds, people across the United States tried to fit the sudden loss into their understanding of spaceflight, which had seemed steady and almost routine only the day before. Teachers spoke softly with students or sent letters home. Families gathered around living room sets, and many who had watched the launch in real time found that the image of the branching cloud would not leave them. At NASA and in the wider government, leaders understood that the nation would want answers about what had happened to the shuttle, its crew, and the promise that the reusable program had represented for years. As smoke thinned over the Atlantic, a longer process of grief search and explanation was beginning everywhere. On the day of the Challenger disaster, the clear winter sky over Florida became the backdrop for a kind of silence that settled in only after the bright cloud began to spread. In the first few heartbeats, people on the coast, in control rooms and in classrooms, could not yet name what they were seeing, but they felt something in their bodies tighten all at once. Where there had been a rising white line, there was now a branching shape hanging in the blue, and every eye that had been following the shuttle began to search that broken plume for the vehicle that was no longer there. In the launch control center near the Cape, some of the first voices to break the stunned pause were the engineers responsible for tracking the boosters and the main engines. They watched their screens as numbers froze or dropped away, heard themselves report that data had been lost, and tried to keep talking even while the cloud on the live video told a different story than the tidy lines on their consoles. In Houston, mission control shifted in an instant from the measured rhythm of ascent calls to a confused mixture of crosstalk and clipped fragments as controllers checked telemetry, searched their procedures, and waited for a voice from the crew that did not come. Almost at once, supervisors ordered the doors closed and the data preserved, turning the rooms where people had just been smiling through launch into sealed spaces where everything said and seen would be kept for the investigation that everyone now knew must follow. Out over the Atlantic, the lines of smoke that marked falling debris began to arc downward toward the water, and within minutes, the tracking systems that watched the flight path were retuned to mark search zones instead of trajectory points. The contingency plans that had long existed only on paper for a failure during ascent were put into effect, and Coast Guard crews, Navy ships, Air Force aircraft, and local boats were alerted that wreckage might be dropping into the ocean across a wide area east of the Cape. Helicopters lifted off from nearby bases and from ships already at sea, flying low over the waves to look for floating pieces of the shuttle, for the parachutes that were part of the crew escape system, and for any sign that someone might have survived the breakup. The ocean that morning looked calm from the shore, but those who flew into the search area found scattered smoke, churning wakes from fast-moving boats, and a debris field that stretched farther than early estimates had suggested. Very quickly, it became clear to the people leading the search that there would be no swift rescue, only a long effort to recover what they could from the sea. Pieces of the external tank, fragments of the orbiter, and sections of the boosters were spotted and marked, while sonar teams began to map objects on the ocean floor that might be parts of the shuttle resting in the cold dark below the waves. Recovery brought together military divers, civilian contractors, and NASA specialists who sorted every find, logged its position, and shipped it back toward shore, where hangars and warehouses would soon be filled with labeled wreckage laid out on long tables. Search aircraft circled for hours above the Atlantic, their crews looking down at the scattered white patches and small bobbing shapes that broke the surface, knowing that each one carried both technical information and human weight. Back on land, the first circle of people to feel the loss in its sharpest form were the families and guests gathered at Kennedy Space Center who had watched the launch from a special viewing area set aside for them. Some had followed previous launches, knew that staging and booster separation could look strange, and for a moment hoped that the curling trails in the sky were part of a plan. Yet very quickly, it became clear from the hushed voices around them that something had gone terribly wrong. NASA staff members trained for this possibility began to move quietly through the stands, asking family groups to come with them, guiding them toward buses and private rooms, and trying to offer comfort even as their own faces showed shock and grief. For the spouses, children, parents, and close friends of the crew, the bright blue Florida morning had turned in a handful of minutes into a day centered on waiting for news that many already dreaded. At Johnson Space Center in Houston, where the crew families usually stayed during missions, word began to spread as well, and staff members who had worked with the astronauts now faced the task of caring for their loved ones in the first hours after the loss. Counselors, chaplains, and friends gathered in meeting rooms and living spaces, answering what questions they could, promising that more information would come, and simply sitting close when there were no words that felt adequate to the moment. Around the same time, in offices and cubicles all across NASA, people who had known the crew professionally stared at their phones, tried to reach co-workers, and wondered how the agency that had carried them through so many successful flights could now feel so suddenly fragile. Some went outside and looked up at the empty sky that now held only the faint remnants of the plume, trying to reconcile that quiet blue with the noise and light that had filled it only minutes before. In newsrooms across the country, the breaking reports of a shuttle accident quickly replaced planned stories and regular programming, and producers began to loop the footage of the launch and the abrupt change in the sky. Commentators who had expected to speak about a teacher in space turned instead to hushed descriptions of the visible plume, the scattered booster trails, and the reports of debris falling into the ocean, often struggling to keep their own emotions out of their voices. In many classrooms, teachers made the choice to turn the sets off, leaving students with only a brief glimpse of the branching cloud, while others kept watching and tried to answer the first questions about what had happened and whether anyone could have survived. Parents at work heard the news from radios, from colleagues in nearby offices, or from hurried phone calls, and many found themselves driving home early to check on children who had watched the event live at school. In Washington, the loss reverberated quickly through the halls of government, where the shuttle program had long been seen as a symbol of American ingenuity and calm technological confidence. President Ronald Reagan had been scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address that evening, a speech meant to cover budgets, policies, and political positions. But within hours of the accident, his staff knew that such a normal event could not go forward as planned. The address was postponed, and attention shifted instead to how the president would speak to a country that had just watched a spacecraft disintegrate in clear view of school children, workers, and families. White House advisors, speechwriters, and communications staff members moved between offices, televisions, and telephones, trying to gauge the mood of the nation and to find words that could acknowledge the depth of the loss without turning the day into a purely political moment. By late afternoon, on the day of the accident, it was clear that the president would speak directly to the country from the Oval Office, a familiar scene in times of crisis that signaled both seriousness and an attempt at reassurance. The brief address that staff members drafted for him would not dwell on technical causes, which were still unknown, but would focus instead on the human meaning of the loss, on the courage of the crew, and on the way a nation might carry their memory forward. Writers drew on the language of exploration, on the long history of risk at the edge of knowledge, and on lines from a pilot and poet whose words about leaving Earth and touching the face of God had long held emotional power for aviators and astronauts. They also made sure to speak directly to the school children who had watched the launch in their classrooms, knowing that for many young viewers, this was their first vivid memory of seeing something go terribly wrong on live television. That evening, as darkness settled over much of the country and over the still active search area off the Florida coast, millions of people gathered around televisions once more to hear the president speak about the loss. He acknowledged the shock, spoke the names of the crew, and recognized that the presence of a teacher on the mission meant that many children had seen the disaster unfold, telling them gently that the future still belonged to exploration and that the world remained worth their curiosity. He reminded viewers that the crew had known the risks, that they had accepted them in the service of discovery, and that the nation would continue its work in space, not to ignore the tragedy, but to honor the spirit that had sent those 7 people aloft. In closing, he spoke the now famous image of travelers leaving the pull of Earth behind and reaching toward the divine, offering a kind of blessing that wrapped the crew's final seconds in language drawn from both faith and flight. When the broadcast ended, some viewers stayed in their seats for a long time, listening to the quiet in their living rooms as if it were part of the address. Others called relatives, checked on friends, or wrote in journals, trying to capture what they had felt as they watched the plume, the falling fragments, and then the president's calm acknowledgement of the loss. For many, the night felt heavier than before. The Challenger disaster left the United States moving through a strange, shared grief that reached from launch pads and control rooms into classrooms and living rooms across the country. People had trusted the shuttle, and the loss felt like a sudden tear in a story they thought was secure forever. In the hours after the sky over Florida changed, news of the explosion moved by phone and television into every time zone. Some people heard it from co-workers leaning into doorways, while others walked past windows and saw strangers gathered around flickering screens. Many people remember where they were then. In classrooms, the Challenger disaster left an echoing quiet as teachers reached for the remote or the power switch with unsteady hands. Some turned the televisions off at once, while others let the image hang for a few seconds before realizing that nothing hopeful would return to the screen. Together. By the next day, flags in many towns flew at half-staff, and makeshift memorials began to appear outside schools, churches, and local government buildings. Children brought flowers, drawings of the shuttle, and handwritten notes taping them to doors or laying them in rows along brick walls and concrete steps. Television networks shifted into long blocks of coverage, replaying the launch and the branching cloud, while anchors spoke more softly than usual. Experts who had once described the shuttle with confident diagrams now traced their fingers along blurry frames, trying to explain what each flicker might mean. No answer came. For children who had watched the Challenger disaster in real time, the images often blurred with dreams and fears that surfaced again at night. Some woke from sleep convinced they had seen the shuttle fall into their own neighborhoods, while others became suddenly afraid of airplanes and tall bridges. Listening. In many schools, the days after the Challenger disaster were filled with hurried meetings, whispered hallway conversations, and difficult decisions about how to talk. Principals asked teachers whether they wanted counselors in their rooms, whether they preferred to show the news, or whether they should keep lessons simple for now. At home that week, families sat around kitchen tables and on couches, trying to answer questions that came from children and from their own unsettled thoughts. Parents who had grown up with the first moon landings now explained that spaceflight had always carried danger, even when it looked calm before. Within NASA, the Challenger disaster pulled thousands of workers into a period of mourning that overlapped with the technical urgency of the investigation. Engineers who had written procedures and signed off on flight readiness reports now attended memorial services, stood in crowded auditoriums, and listened to mission songs played slowly. Across the country, communities held vigils in school gyms, town halls, and houses of worship, lighting candles and reading the names of the 7 crew members aloud. Musicians played quiet pieces, choirs sang simple songs, and speakers tried to connect national headlines with the personal sorrow in each seat there. Teachers who had once planned to record lessons from orbit now found themselves creating assignments that let students express what they felt about the loss. Younger children drew rockets surrounded by hearts and stars, while older students wrote letters to the families, to NASA, or to the explorers they imagined. In some classrooms, teachers wheeled televisions back out to show the president's evening address, hoping his calm voice might give their students something steady to hold. They listened together as he spoke about bravery and exploration, and many students remembered the quiet of that moment more clearly than his words. In conversations at work and school, the Challenger disaster led people to ask what it meant to call astronauts heroes and how much risk a nation should accept. Some argued that the mission had been too public and that a teacher should not have flown on such an uncertain system. Others believed that sending ordinary citizens on the shuttle had been a way to share the promise of space with everyone, even if it carried extra pain. They talked about explorers on ships and early flyers in fragile planes, and they said that progress had always asked for courage everywhere. In the hometowns of the crew, the Challenger disaster took on an even more intimate shape as neighbors and friends remembered ordinary errands and small conversations. They pictured quick waves in grocery store aisles, brief chats after services, and children playing in yards that now felt strangely quiet at home. In Concord, New Hampshire, where Krista McAuliffe had taught social studies, the Challenger disaster was felt in the halls of a single high school more sharply than anywhere else. Students looked at her desk, at the posters on her walls, at the empty parking space, and many cried in silence. For teachers across the country, the Challenger disaster raised a private ache because one of their own had stepped onto the launch pad and never returned. Staff rooms filled with quiet talk about lesson plans, about the courage teaching required, and about what it meant to keep going for them. For many young people, the Challenger disaster was the first national tragedy they could remember clearly, and it shaped how they understood danger and public loss. Teachers asked them to write about their feelings, and some described the sky splitting, the drifting smoke, and the way grown-ups looked unsure. Older adults compared the Challenger disaster to the assassination of President Kennedy and to other moments when ordinary routines were interrupted by unexpected breaking news. They spoke about radios turned up in car dashboards, televisions rolled into cafeterias, and the feeling that history had stepped into the middle of the day. Some Americans did not see the Challenger disaster live, only hearing about it later on the radio or catching a replay as they walked past a screen. Even for them, the news settled in with a heavy weight, as if a familiar promise about progress had grown thinner overnight everywhere, in places that depended heavily on the space program, such as the coastal towns near the Cape and the neighborhoods around Houston. The Challenger disaster carried economic worries as well. Workers who built components, cleaned facilities, or staffed nearby businesses wondered if long pauses in launches would threaten their jobs. As the first shock faded, newspapers and television stations turned toward the stories of the 7 people lost in the Challenger disaster, filling pages and segments with their faces. Viewers learned about their childhoods, the music they liked, their jokes in training, and the paths from ordinary neighborhoods to orbit. National events paused to acknowledge the loss, with moments of silence at sports games, concerts, and public gatherings where people stood together in crowded arenas. The Space Agency logo appeared on scoreboards and program covers, and the names of the crew were spoken to audiences who might not follow launches. In many churches, synagogues, and other gathering places, leaders spoke about the loss in sermons and reflections that tried to give shape to the sorrow people carried. They reminded their communities that grief could be shared, that mourning could be public, and that caring for one another was an answer. As the first week passed, mourning for the Challenger disaster slowly intertwined with a growing need to understand why the shuttle had been lost so suddenly. Families wanted clear answers about what their loved ones had faced, and citizens who watched on television wanted reassurance that mistakes would not return. Teachers joined that search for meaning because students kept asking whether the same thing could happen again and whether anyone knew what had gone wrong. Many teachers answered honestly that they did not yet know, promising to follow the investigation and to return to the topic when facts were clear. In living rooms and workplaces, the mood became a mixture of sorrow and watchfulness as people waited to see who would lead the official search for answers to the Challenger disaster. They watched press conferences, listened for promises of honesty, and hoped leaders would be willing to confront hard truths. Meanwhile, the physical search at sea continued day after day, helicopters skimming the surface while ships dragged nets and sonar across the broad debris field. Families and co-workers followed brief updates about recovered fragments, knowing that each piece could help explain the failure and also confirm the loss more fully. As winter slipped toward spring, public rituals of mourning for the Challenger disaster grew less frequent, but the memory stayed close in the routines of classrooms and homes. Students still pointed to shuttle posters. Teachers paused before mentioning space, and families looked up on clear nights with slightly guarded curiosity. In this quieter phase, the Challenger disaster became not only a memory of a single morning, but a standing question about how a trusted system had failed. People began to follow early announcements about a presidential commission, wondering who would serve and how deeply they would examine the shuttle program. In many workplaces, far from NASA, workers quietly compared their own experiences with safety and management to what they were hearing about the Challenger disaster. They talked about times when concerns had been brushed aside, when production outranked caution, and when people felt pressure to accept problems as normal then. For some children, the Challenger disaster did not extinguish their interest in space, but instead turned it into a quieter, more serious curiosity about how things worked. They began to read about engines and orbits, about astronauts and engineers, and some decided that they wanted to help prevent failures someday. In those weeks of mourning, the country carried both sorrow and questions, holding on to the image of the broken plume while waiting for a careful accounting of what had gone wrong. Out of that long quiet would come hearings, voices, and truths about decisions and systems that people had trusted. Challenger disaster investigations in 1986 soon centered on a presidential commission that tried to explain what had gone wrong with the shuttle and why warnings had been missed after the bright plume faded over Florida. The White House faced questions from Congress, the press, and ordinary citizens about how such a trusted system could fail so suddenly. Leaders knew that the answers could not come only from NASA's own offices, because the space agency itself was now part of what had to be examined. So they created an outside body, the Rogers Commission, named for former Secretary of State William Rogers, and asked it to look deeply into both the technical failure and the human decisions behind the launch. Weeks after Challenger disaster shocked the nation, the members of the Rogers Commission took their seats at long hearing tables in Washington and began to listen. Alongside William Rogers sat familiar figures from American flight and science, including astronaut Neil Armstrong, test pilot Chuck Yeager, Air Force General Donald Kutina, physicist Richard Feynman, and astronaut Sally Ride. Their names carried weight, and their presence signaled that the inquiry would not be a quiet internal review. Cameras, microphones, and rows of reporters turned the hearings into a public classroom where the country could watch experts and witnesses explain, in careful language, how a complex system had failed and what it might reveal about the culture that built it. From the start, Challenger disaster shaped not only what the Commission studied, but also how openly it felt compelled to speak families of the crew wanted clear answers, not vague reassurances, and the wider public had seen the loss live, without filters. That visibility made it hard for anyone to treat the investigation as a matter of quiet paperwork. Commissioners understood that they were not simply examining bolts and seals, but also the trust between citizens and the institutions responsible for their safety. Every chart, memo, and sworn statement would feed into that larger question of trust. Early sessions of the Rogers Commission focused on reconstructing the timeline of Challenger disaster, second by second. NASA officials described the countdown, the freezing night, the ice inspections, the conference with Morton Thiokol, and the final decision to proceed. Engineers walked through telemetry records, pointing to pressures and temperatures that had looked normal right up until the moment of breakup. Slow-motion films of the launch were shown frame by frame, revealing the tiny flicker of flame from the right booster joint that almost no one had noticed on launch day. The hearings began to transform that flicker into the central clue of the case. As testimony accumulated, the story emerging around Challenger disaster pointed again and again to the solid rocket booster joints and their O-ring seals. Thiokol engineers described years of erosion and blow-by, those dark streaks of soot that showed hot gas had slipped past the primary seal. They explained that they had grown more concerned after cold launches, when the rubber seemed slower to flex and close the gap. They also told the Commission about memos that warned of possible catastrophic failure and about the still unfinished plans for a redesigned joint that might have protected the shuttle more reliably. One of the most remembered moments of the Rogers Commission came when Richard Feynman used a simple demonstration to show the risk that coal posed to the O-rings at the heart of Challenger disaster. Sitting before cameras, he dropped a small piece of the rubber-like material into a glass of ice water, waited, then pulled it out and showed how stiff it had become. He explained in plain words that a seal that might work at room temperature could fail to move quickly enough after spending a long night in freezing air. The demonstration turned an abstract engineering concern into something any viewer could feel in their own fingers. Beyond the physics, the Rogers Commission dug into how decisions had been made in the days and hours before Challenger disaster. Witnesses from NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and from Thiokol described the crucial teleconference on the eve of launch. Engineers recalled their strong recommendation not to fly in such deep cold, and their belief that the joints might not seal. Managers recalled asking for more data, questioning whether the temperature trend was truly decisive, and weighing previous flights that had shown damage but not failure. The Commission listened for the gap between what the engineers feared and what the managers were willing to put in writing. As more details surfaced, Challenger disaster began to look less like a single unlucky event and more like the result of patterns that had built up over years. The Commission heard how NASA's schedule for the shuttle had grown crowded, with ambitious promises about launch rates and a long line of commercial, scientific, and military payloads waiting for their turn. Delays were costly in money and reputation, and each scrub reached back through the calendar, disturbing plans made in faraway offices. In that climate, a mission that had already slipped several times and that carried the teacher in space, felt especially important to keep on track. The Rogers Commission also examined how risk information about Challenger disaster had moved and sometimes stalled inside NASA's layers of management. Engineers had kept detailed records of O-ring erosion, joint rotation, and cold temperature performance. Yet the way those records were summarized and presented meant that higher-level managers often saw small boxes and brief notes rather than the full texture of the engineer's worry. Over time, repeated signs of trouble were reclassified as an accepted feature of operations, a process that scholars later called normalization of deviance. What had once been shocking evidence of seal damage slowly became part of the background noise of shuttle work. In its questioning, the Commission pressed NASA leaders about how they judged the probability of failure in the years leading to Challenger disaster. Some managers had spoken confidently of odds like 1 in 100,000 for a catastrophic shuttle loss, numbers that made spaceflight seem nearly as safe as commercial aviation. Engineers closer to the hardware had always believed the risk was much higher, but their more cautious estimates seldom appeared in public. The hearings laid those differences side by side, showing how optimistic numbers had helped support ambitious launch promises and had made it easier to accept flying with unresolved problems. For families listening to the proceedings, Challenger disaster gradually shifted from a mysterious accident to a tragedy with clear human roots. They heard about memos that used the word catastrophic, about test data that hinted at fatal vulnerabilities, and about meetings where engineers felt overruled or unheard. It was painful to learn that people had worried in detail about the very scenario that had taken their loved ones. Yet many relatives also felt that naming those failures honestly was a way of honoring the crew, because it opened the possibility that others might be spared by a different future culture. Eventually, the Rogers Commission issued a formal report on Challenger disaster that combined technical findings with blunt criticism of NASA's decision-making. The report confirmed that hot gases had escaped through a failed O-ring on the right booster, burned through the joint, and fatally weakened the connection with the external tank. It stated that the risk of flying in such cold conditions had been known but not acted on, and that the launch should not have gone forward that morning. Just as important, it described flaws in communication, management structure, and safety oversight that had allowed a critical hazard to persist despite years of warning signs. In plain language, the report on Challenger disaster said that NASA had developed a flawed safety culture. It found that the people responsible for launch decisions did not always hear, understand, or respect the concerns raised by those closest to the hardware. It criticized the separation between program managers and safety officers, and the way that risk assessments were shaped to fit schedule demands. It recommended structural changes, including a stronger independent safety office, better channels for dissenting views, and a redesigned joint that would not depend on a single rubber seal performing perfectly in all conditions. These recommendations pointed toward a needed reshaping of how the agency thought about danger. Inside NASA, reading the findings on Challenger disaster was a sobering experience that blended grief with a kind of professional shame. Many engineers felt that the Commission had finally said aloud what they had sensed for years, that schedule pressure and optimism had slowly outweighed caution in everyday decisions. Managers who had believed they were defending the program by keeping launches moving now saw in the report a mirror that showed how those choices had looked to outsiders. Training sessions, internal memos, and long meetings followed as people tried to absorb the lessons and to imagine new ways of speaking up when something felt wrong. Outside the agency, the report helped citizens see that the loss of Challenger had not been an act of fate alone, but the product of systems that could, in principle, be changed. That realization made the tragedy heavier, yet it also opened the door to hope that future crews might be better protected. In the months after the report, work began to reshape hardware, procedures, and the very language of risk inside the shuttle program. The nation would not see another launch for a long time, and launch pads stayed quiet while redesign and reflection moved forward behind the scenes. In that long pause, the story of Challenger disaster shifted once more, from the question of what had gone wrong to the harder task of rebuilding trust and reshaping the shuttle so that returning to flight would mean something more than simply lighting the engines again. That work would reshape policy, training, and quiet expectations. Challenger disaster forced the United States to look not only at broken hardware, but at the culture inside NASA that had allowed danger to grow quietly. In the months after the loss, investigators and workers began to ask why warnings had been softened, why risk had been treated as normal, and how communication had failed between people who all wanted the same safe outcome. The answers to those questions were not simple villains or simple heroes. They lived in habits, in systems, and in a way of thinking about success that had slowly drifted away from caution. For many years before the loss, people inside NASA had grown up in a culture shaped by Apollo and earlier triumphs. The agency had landed astronauts on the moon, flown complex missions, and recovered from earlier accidents by working even harder. That history created a strong belief that careful engineering and teamwork could master almost any problem. It also made it difficult to imagine that a single seal, a single joint, or a single meeting could bring down an entire shuttle and 7 lives. Within that history, the shuttle program was presented as a step toward routine spaceflight, almost like an airline that happened to leave the atmosphere. Launches became more frequent, and successful missions began to feel like proof that the system was sound. When problems appeared, they tended to be folded into the story of a tough machine that could tolerate rough edges. Over time, success became its own kind of evidence, even when the number of flights was still small and the margins were thinner than many believed. Investigators later used the phrase normalization of deviance to describe what had happened to the O-ring problem inside the shuttle world. The first time soot appeared past a seal, many people were alarmed, and the reports carried a strong sense of danger. As similar damage showed up again and again without an immediate disaster, the same pattern started to feel routine. What should have remained a loud warning slowly became another line on a chart, another problem to watch, but not to stop the program for. Inside Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, where the solid rocket boosters were managed, people worked closely with Mourning Thiokol engineers, yet lived under schedule and budget pressures of their own. Reports moved upward through layers of supervisors and program managers before they reached the desks of senior leaders. At each step, language could soften, charts could be rearranged, and worst-case phrases could be replaced with careful technical terms. By the time concerns about cold or erosion reached high-level reviews, they often sounded like issues to manage rather than reasons to stand down. At the same time, the broader program carried a heavy schedule that pushed everyone toward keeping launches on track. Commercial customers waited with satellites already built. Military payloads were tied to plans that stretched far beyond the launch site. The teacher in Space Mission had drawn special attention from the public and from the White House. For many managers, another delay felt not only like a technical choice, but like a broken promise to schools, to sponsors, and to a country they believed needed to see a shuttle rise. When engineers and managers met by telephone on the night before the launch, these pressures and habits traveled silently along the lines with them. The engineers from Utah spoke about data, about past erosion, and about the cold rubber that worried them. They did not want to see another flight until temperatures rose into a range they considered safer. Managers on both sides of the line asked for more proof, pointed to previous flights that had flown with some damage, and reminded everyone that no booster joint had yet failed completely. In that exchange, the burden of proof quietly shifted. Instead of asking whether it was clearly safe to fly, managers asked whether there was absolute proof that the launch would fail. The engineers could not supply that kind of certainty, so their warnings, grounded in limited data and long experience, sounded less solid than the reassuring fact that the shuttle had already flown many times. Communication inside this culture carried emotional weight that did not always appear on the transcripts. Engineers worried about being seen as obstacles who slowed progress. Managers worried about appearing timid in front of superiors and customers. People who raised concerns sometimes looked for softer phrases or for ways to frame their doubt as a question instead of a firm no. Over years, that pattern taught others to treat firm resistance as rare and to treat qualified assent as the normal tone of technical discussion. The Rogers Commission urged NASA to change that pattern by creating stronger, more independent safety channels, but the deeper lesson reached beyond any chart of offices. A healthy safety culture needs places where bad news can travel quickly without being reshaped to please. It needs leaders who invite blunt words and treat them as a service. It also needs tools and training that help workers at every level translate their close-up worries into clear messages that senior managers cannot easily ignore. For the wider country, the loss encouraged a different kind of conversation about risk and heroism. Astronauts had long been framed as brave figures who knowingly accepted danger in order to push the frontier. After the shuttle broke apart, many people began to ask what it meant to accept risk when the risks were shaped not just by nature and physics, but by organizational choices. The idea of courage did not disappear, but it was joined by a sharper awareness that bravery alone could not compensate for weak structures and muted warnings. In the years that followed, NASA tried to reshape daily practice around these lessons. Training programs encouraged workers to speak openly about hazards. New reporting systems allowed anonymous safety concerns. Launch decisions had to be reviewed by independent voices who could say no without fearing career harm. These changes did not erase past pain, but they offered a way to honor the crew by building a culture where uncomfortable truths were less likely to be buried. Outside the space program, leaders in aviation, medicine, energy, and many other fields studied the Challenger case as a warning. They saw how intelligent, well-meaning people had drifted together toward unsafe choices without noticing the full danger. Many organizations began to ask whether they too had normalized deviance, whether long stretches without visible accidents had dulled their concern about warning signs. The story of the lost shuttle became part of safety briefings, case studies, and quiet conversations in break rooms and training halls. At a smaller scale, the culture around Challenger touched the daily lives of individual workers who often saw only a narrow slice of the whole system. A technician might spend a career checking valves, tightening bolts, or inspecting tile edges and see mostly personal pride in careful work. An engineer might pore over data for one equipment family and never feel the weight of how their graphs would be summarized 3 levels up. The gap between those close-up views and the decisions made in program-level meetings was one of the spaces where risk could swell unseen. On paper, checklists and formal reviews gave the impression that every risk had a clear box and a clear answer. Meetings ended with signatures on readiness documents and with phrases that sounded firm, yet the true picture was more fluid, shaped by moods, relationships, and unspoken expectations. A concern that began as a bold red mark on one chart could be recast as a manageable item on the next, simply because everyone wanted to believe that the shuttle would fly. Many people who later reflected on the loss saw in it a very human tendency. When a task is repeated often without visible harm, it begins to feel safer than it really is. Schedules and habits wrap around it like layers of cloth, softening the sharp edges in memory. The shuttle had not yet flown enough times to justify that comfort, but the rhythm of launches and landings had already created the feeling of a well-worn path. For the families of the crew, learning about this culture was painful but important. It meant that their loved ones had not been lost solely because of one bad part or one careless choice. They had been placed at risk by a web of habits, pressures, and misjudgments that had built up over years. Many relatives spoke publicly about their hope that NASA would truly change that web so that future crews would not have to carry the same hidden weight into the sky. Across the wider public, the story of Challenger began to shift from shock toward reflection. People still felt pride in the idea of exploration and in the courage of those who flew. Yet that pride now lived beside a quiet doubt. Could large institutions be trusted to guard against their own optimism? Could citizens ask hard questions without being brushed aside? The Challenger story encouraged many people to see safety not as a dry technical topic, but as a shared responsibility. Inside NASA, those questions settled into daily life during the long pause that followed the accident. Launch pads sat empty. Training schedules were torn up and rewritten. Engineers who had once worked only on performance now placed equal focus on failure modes and safety margins. Managers who had once measured success in flight rates began to measure it in the strength of their safety reviews. Slowly, and not without resistance, the organization tried to turn its new understanding of culture and communication into concrete changes in hardware, procedures, and habits. From that quieter season of self-examination, a new phase would emerge as engineers and crews prepared to redesign the shuttle and return it to flight. After the Challenger disaster, NASA entered a long season of redesign and reflection before the shuttle could return to flight. In the months after the accident, launch pads stayed quiet, hangars filled with grounded orbiters, and the bright image of a rising plume gave way to drawings of joints, seals, and safety charts. For engineers, managers, and families, the path meant that nothing about the shuttle could be taken for granted again. Inside NASA, work on the redesigned boosters became one of the clearest responses to the Challenger disaster and one of the most visible tests of new safety habits. The field joints in the solid rocket motors had failed once, and no one wanted to see another launch scheduled before the hardware itself was different in shape and behavior. Design teams in Utah, Alabama, and Florida gathered drawings, mock-ups, and fragments from the Atlantic and began to imagine joints that would move less, seal faster, and carry more protection from heat and cold. At the heart of the technical work stood the booster joint, a ring of metal segments whose tiny gap had once allowed flame to escape during the ill-fated ascent. Investigators had shown that the original design let the joint flex outward under pressure, pulling the O-ring away from its sealing surface at the very moment the rocket needed it most. In low temperatures, the rubber stiffened, slowed, and failed to follow the moving metal quickly enough to keep hot gas from cutting through. To answer that weakness, the redesigned booster used a capture feature, a thicker metal lip inside the joint that limited how far the pieces could rotate away from one another under load. Engineers added a third O-ring to help seat the primary seal and to provide another barrier should insulation or putty ever be breached. The insulation itself was reshaped so that it pressed more firmly into the corners of the joint and relied less on a material that could crack or pull away with age. Another lesson from the Challenger disaster focused on temperature, so the new design included heaters and better insulation around the joints to keep the seals within a safer range. Sensors were improved to track pressure and motion in real time, giving controllers clearer data if a joint ever behaved in an unexpected way. Quality checks during assembly grew stricter, with new gauges, photographs, and sign-offs at each stage so that any flaw in the metal or the rubber would be caught before the segments ever left the factory floor. Static fire tests in the desert gave the redesigned system its first loud trials. Long before any crew would ride the flames again, full-scale boosters were bolted down horizontally, packed with sensors, and ignited so that engineers could watch every vibration, every pressure spike, and every hint of gas, trying to find a path through the joints. Some tests even included intentional flaws, so that the new capture features and seals would be forced to prove their strength under worst-case conditions, not only in perfectly built motors. While the booster redesign moved ahead, Challenger disaster also drove changes in how NASA organized safety and oversight across the entire shuttle program. The Rogers Commission had called for a stronger independent voice, so the agency created a higher-level office devoted to safety, reliability, and quality assurance, with authority that did not depend on launch schedules or program budgets. New channels allowed engineers to raise concerns without fear that their warnings would be softened as they climbed through layers of management. Challenger disaster had shown that culture could be as dangerous as hardware, so NASA also tried to reshape daily habits in mission control rooms, design offices, and contractor plants. Training sessions encouraged people at every level to speak plainly when something worried them, and managers were urged to invite dissent instead of treating it as a threat to the program. Checklists and flight readiness reviews were rewritten so that safety questions would be asked and answered in more than one room, by more than one group of eyes. Beyond the boosters, the orbiters themselves changed in ways that grew out of the Challenger disaster and earlier worries about crew survival. New pressure suits replaced the lighter garments worn on the lost flight, giving astronauts better protection during ascent and entry, and making some forms of emergency escape more realistic. Equipment inside the cabin was rearranged to keep escape paths clearer, and new procedures were written so that crews would have more options if something went wrong at certain points in flight. For more than 2 years after the Challenger disaster, the shuttle fleet stayed on the ground while these technical and cultural changes took shape. Launch pads stood empty against the sky, their towers lit at night only by maintenance lights and the glow from nearby towns, while inside offices, people pored over new standards and test reports. The long pause felt heavy, but it also gave the agency time to prove to itself and to the country that return to flight would mean more than a simple restart. As the redesigned boosters passed their tests and new safety structures settled into place, planners began to shape the mission that would carry the first crew back into orbit after the Challenger disaster. The flight was designated STS-26 and assigned to the Orbiter Discovery, a vehicle that had flown successfully before the accident and that now would bear the weight of returning Americans to space. Its primary payload would be a tracking and data relay satellite, the kind of workhorse communication craft that had long supported human and robotic missions alike. The crew chosen for the return to flight carried both experience and the quiet knowledge of what the Challenger disaster had taken. Commander Rick Houck had flown before and now led a team that included pilot Dick Covey and mission specialists Mike Lounge, David Hilmers, and George Nelson. They trained in a program reshaped by the accident, one that dwelled on emergency scenarios, on speaking up, and on understanding the engineering behind the systems that supported them. As launch day in September 1988 approached, the mood around Kennedy Space Center was markedly different from the air of routine that had often surrounded pre-Challenger flights. Security was tighter, review meetings were longer, and visitors sensed that every person on site carried a private memory of the lost crew. The launch team held a final flight readiness review that lasted through long hours, testing not only equipment, but also the new habit of asking whether anyone still held a serious, unspoken objection. When Discovery finally stood fueled on the pad, the shadows of the Challenger disaster were acknowledged openly rather than pushed aside. Ceremonies honored the lost crew. Mission patches carried subtle tributes, and many of the people now in key roles had spent the earlier years recovering debris, reading painful reports, or sitting with grieving families. They knew that this launch was not a return to normal, but the start of a different relationship with risk, one that would always remember how much had been lost. On launch morning, clouds drifted over the coast as Discovery's orange tank and white boosters rose slowly above the pad on television screens and through the thick glass of the firing room. Inside the cabin, the crew wore new orange pressure suits and carried with them the quiet thoughts of friends and colleagues who would never fly again. The countdown voice sounded as calm as ever, but in many offices and classrooms, people listening held their breath through each number, waiting for either a halt or a clean ignition. When the engines lit and the booster flames poured outward, the scene resembled earlier flights, yet every small change in pitch or smoke was watched more closely than ever before. Controllers tracked data from the redesigned joints in real time, ready to call an abort if any sensor hinted at trouble in the boosters or the tank. As Discovery climbed, and the call came that it had passed through maximum dynamic pressure, with all systems performing, some people in the control rooms allowed themselves to exhale for the first time. The moment of booster separation, which had once been recorded only as a routine milestone, carried special weight for everyone who remembered that the Challenger disaster had begun in a booster joint. When the solid rockets peeled away cleanly, their trails curving off to fall into the ocean, a deeper relief spread through control rooms, offices, and homes. Only after main engine cutoff and the confirmation of a stable orbit did many of the people closest to the mission let themselves feel that the hardest part of the return to flight was truly behind them. During the days in orbit, Discovery's crew deployed their satellite, conducted small experiments, and spoke to the ground with a tone that mixed professional focus and a quieter gratitude for the chance simply to be there. Viewers who had once watched a teacher ride the shuttle now saw a more guarded image of spaceflight, one in which technical detail and sober language shared the stage with images of Earth and floating tools. When Discovery glided back through the atmosphere and touched down on the long runway at Edwards Air Force Base, cheers and tears mingled in the landing control rooms and among families watching from the desert. The successful flight did not erase the Challenger disaster, but it showed that the painful lessons from that morning had been carried into redesigned metal, revised procedures, and a more cautious frame of mind. In the years that followed, each new mission would rise into a sky that still held the memory of Challenger, and every countdown would unfold under the quiet promise that those 7 lives had changed how America flew. In the years after the Challenger disaster, NASA, schools, and families learned what it meant to live with a loss that never left. The launch pads at Florida and the control rooms in Houston kept working, but the memory of that clear winter morning sat inside every countdown. For many people who had watched the plume break apart, spaceflight no longer felt like a distant spectacle. It felt personal and fragile in a new way. The question that slowly formed was not only how to fly again, but how to carry the story of those 7 lives into the future. Inside NASA, the Challenger disaster became a permanent part of training, orientation, and daily speech. New engineers learned about O-rings, cold weather, and communication failures before they ever touched a console. And the names of the crew were spoken in classrooms where people practiced how to say no when something felt unsafe. Mission control simulations included scenarios where data looked unclear, and young controllers were reminded that staying silent could be as dangerous as any hardware flaw. Over time, the story of that launch became less of a distant case study and more of a shared caution that shaped how people signed their names on every flight readiness line. In classrooms, the Challenger disaster continued to live as more than a sad story shown on an anniversary. Teachers used it to talk about science, ethics, and the weight of real decisions, inviting students to see that behind every launch were people who could speak up or stay quiet. For some young listeners, the story planted fear, but for many others, it planted a more serious kind of curiosity about engineering and responsibility. Over the years, projects and essays about the crew sat on bulletin boards beside science fair posters, reminding students that space was both inspiring and demanding. In the wake of the Challenger disaster, the families of the crew helped build something new from their loss. They worked with educators and supporters to create Challenger centers, hands-on space learning sites where students could run simulated missions, sit at mock control consoles, and practice solving problems together. At these centers, children wearing simple headsets learn to read checklists, report data, and manage small surprises, all while hearing stories about the teacher and astronauts who had never made it to orbit. Instead of letting the launch be only an ending, the families helped turn it into thousands of small beginnings in classrooms around the country. For many teachers, the Challenger disaster also marked the start of a longer conversation about who belongs on space missions. The original Teacher in Space program was never resumed in quite the same way, but NASA created an educator-astronaut role that allowed classroom teachers to join the Corps as full professionals rather than one-time visitors. Barbara Morgan, who had trained as Krista McAuliffe's backup, kept working with the agency, first as a communicator to schools and later as an astronaut herself. When she finally flew on a shuttle flight years later, many educators saw it as a quiet completion of a promise that had been left hanging in the air over Florida. Across the United States, the Challenger disaster left its mark on buildings, plaques, and place names. Schools, learning centers, and small-town libraries took on the names of individual crew members so that students might one day ask who McNair or Resnick or Scobie had been. At Kennedy Space Center, an astronaut memorial carried their names alongside others lost in earlier missions, with sunlight and falling water moving quietly over the carved stone. City streets, planetariums, and scholarships also carried pieces of the story, turning everyday routes and routines into small reminders that a shuttle once broke apart in full view of the country. For the families most directly touched by the Challenger disaster, legacy and daily life were tightly woven. Birthdays, graduations, and quiet holidays arrived with empty chairs that could not be filled by public honors or news specials. Some relatives chose to stay out of the spotlight, keeping their mourning close within circles of friends and local communities. Others became visible advocates for changes in aerospace safety, education, or public service, speaking at schools, conferences, and memorial events about the people they loved and the choices that had led to the loss. For the children who had watched the Challenger disaster from school desks, the legacy felt different from the official reports and monuments. Many of them remembered not the exact shape of the cloud, but the way the room went quiet and how the adults around them seemed suddenly unsure. As they grew older, some found that the memory surfaced whenever they saw a rocket launch or a plane lift off, a reminder that even events presented as routine carried real risk. Others traced their interest in engineering, journalism, or public policy back to that morning when they first realized that the systems around them were built by people who could make mistakes. In popular memory, the Challenger disaster settled into the same kind of question that older generations had asked about other turning points. People would say where they had been when they saw the plume, in the same tone used for presidential assassinations, or blackouts, or great storms. Television specials returned on major anniversaries, showing slow-motion footage and interviews with engineers, teachers, and family members who retraced the choices that led to that morning. Books for general readers and for children told the story in calmer language than the live coverage had, gently weaving the names of the crew into the broader history of spaceflight. Within space policy, the Challenger disaster continued to shape choices long after flights had resumed. When NASA planned long-term projects such as the International Space Station or new launch vehicles, reviewers asked how their designs would avoid the kind of single-point weaknesses that had hidden in the booster joints. Budget debates in Congress sometimes invoked the loss, with supporters arguing that safety work and steady schedules were not luxuries, but part of honoring past crews. Inside the agency, younger employees who had joined after the accident listened closely when older colleagues described the years before the launch, looking for patterns they did not want to repeat. When another shuttle was lost years later, many commentators looked back to the Challenger disaster and asked which lessons had truly taken root. The Columbia accident brought a different set of technical causes, yet investigators again saw familiar patterns in how warnings moved and how schedule pressures shaped decisions. For the families of both crews, the two events felt linked, not because they were the same, but because they showed how hard it is for any large system to hold on to caution over time. After that second loss, the earlier story of Challenger was told again, with even more urgency, as people argued that honest memory had to be matched by steady change. Beyond spaceflight, the Challenger disaster became a touchstone in safety training for fields that worked with aircraft, energy, medicine, and large public systems. Managers and frontline workers studied how communication had broken down, how repeated small warnings had been absorbed into routine, and how people who cared deeply about their work could still make choices that put others at risk. In corporate classrooms and university seminars, the launch often appeared alongside industrial accidents and hospital case studies, a reminder that technology alone cannot protect people if organizations ignore their own unease. The story encouraged some workplaces to create clearer paths for speaking up, to invite questions from newer staff, and to treat doubt not as disloyalty, but as part of the job. In museums and visitor centers, the Challenger disaster helped change how space stories were told to the public. Exhibits began to mix models of rockets and gleaming suits with panels that described failures openly, showing that the path to orbit had included fire, loss, and long periods of pause. Guides and volunteers spoke about bravery, but they also talked about checklists, discipline, and the quiet work of saying no when a system was not ready. When families walked through displays, children might press buttons to hear launches and astronaut voices, while nearby their parents read timelines that included that winter morning and the years of recovery that followed. As the decades after the Challenger disaster moved forward, fewer people remembered the launch itself, but more grew up knowing its story through books, lessons, and memorials. For some, the event became a symbol of what could go wrong when pride and hurry outran caution, while for others, it remained a testament to courage and curiosity. In American life, those two views usually sat side by side, with memorial speeches and classroom lessons acknowledging both the cost of the loss and the value of the work. On clear days when a new rocket climbed toward orbit, some viewers found themselves glancing at the sky a second time, measuring the plume and thinking of that morning. In families and schools, stories about the crew were passed down in shorter versions, small enough for younger listeners, but still honest about what had been lost. Across the country, the story kept shaping how Americans talked about risk, grief, and space. The Challenger disaster now lives quietly inside American memory today. It surfaces on anniversaries, in documentaries, and in classroom conversations. It is part of how the United States dreams now. It shadows how the country worries about risk and technology. This chapter lingers with that memory and its quiet adjustments. In the first years after the loss, remembrance felt immediate. People who watched the launch remembered branching smoke that morning. Many could replay moments, from roll call to final silence. Now a different generation knows the event, only through retelling. Their memories begin with stories, photographs, and chosen classroom footage. Across the United States, the event sits beside other tragedies. People mention it with assassinations, attacks, storms, and sudden explosions. Each carries images that feel simple until you remember weight. For Challenger, it is the split plume against winter blue. For many, that picture still appears whenever a rocket launches. Each January, ceremonies mark the Challenger disaster at NASA centers. Workers gather beside walls, photographs, and mission patches under glass. Speakers read the crew names slowly, letting each one settle. Moments of silence stretch longer than the program requires today. Outside official events, individuals remember in smaller, more private ways. For the families, the Challenger disaster lives inside ordinary days. Birthdays, graduations, and holidays arrive with one chair permanently empty. Public memorials mean something, but private rituals carry deeper comfort. Some relatives speak, traveling, answering questions, shaping safety conversations nationwide. Others prefer circles, local services, and unscripted moments of remembrance. Museums across the country hold artifacts that point back there. Visitors see suits, mission patches, training notes, and shuttle fragments. Exhibit panels describe the launch, the investigation, and the redesign. Guides pause before those sections, letting visitors feel the weight. Children may focus on buttons and levers. Adults read closely. Challenger centers extend the story beyond display cases into learning. At these sites, students sit at consoles and simulate missions. They practice communication, solving, and calm responses when systems misbehave. Facilitators explain that crews face real stakes behind similar checklists. The mood stays hopeful, but absence behind the name lingers. Teachers keep weaving the Challenger disaster into lessons about science. Some focus on choices. Others highlight communication and accountability structures. They invite students to imagine themselves in meetings before launch. Questions follow about courage, pressure, and when to say stop. In moments, the crew becomes more than photographs and dates. Films and documentaries return to the launch, investigation, and aftermath. Some focus on engineers and managers, others on families grieving. Occasional dramatizations risk simplifying, yet they keep memory circulating widely. Viewers who were children then revisit their own first reactions. New audiences watch and learn, then carry the story forward. Later, shuttle years carried the Challenger disaster like a companion. Each mission rose through the sky, under stricter eyes below. The later loss of Columbia reopened wounds and repeated questions. People asked whether Challenger lessons had settled into daily practice. Eventually, the shuttle fleet retired, leaving museums and footage behind. New rockets now rise from Florida, some carrying private logos. Launch coverage features graphics, smartphone video, and cheering crowds online. Yet whenever smoke curls upward, some viewers remember January morning. They feel a brief pause, a careful breath before cheering. The story of Challenger rides silently with each new countdown. For Americans, the Challenger disaster softened how they see progress. It suggested advancement requires humility, listening, and patience with limits. It reminded people that mourning and curiosity can live together. The crew's story invites bravery, including speaking up before harm. In that sense, remembrance itself becomes part of the safeguard. Local memorials give the Challenger disaster shape in specific places. A school hallway shows framed photos, letters, and mission descriptions. A library corner holds books about shuttles beside children's drawings. A small plaque near a flagpole remembers a local connection. These details let national loss feel close without overwhelming anyone. Many congregations still name the crew during certain yearly services. Readers speak each name carefully, sometimes mispronouncing, always trying respectfully. Older members remember the launch day. Younger ones imagine instead. Prayers mention astronauts, engineers, teachers, and everyone touched by risk. Such rituals thread this story into patterns of national mourning. People who worked through the Challenger disaster carried lessons forward. Some retired quietly, taking memories of consoles and hangars home. Others stayed to mentor younger staff, repeating warnings about complacency. They told stories of memos, meetings, and the investigation days. Their presence helped memory become practice, not only commemorative words. School children who watched the launch have grown into parents now. Some talk about that morning when their children study space. They describe the televisions, the cloud, and the sudden quiet. Sometimes they stop mid-sentence, surprised by emotion after years. Their children listen closely, realizing history can unfold without warning. Textbooks now treat the Challenger disaster as science and civics. One chapter lists causes, asks students about responsibility and change. Diagrams show joints and seals. Timelines show debates and decisions. Teachers sometimes add their memories or notes from parents, grandparents. The event becomes a bridge between pages and lived experience. Beyond the United States, people remember watching that morning unfold. News broadcasts carried the plume into rooms far from Florida. For them, the tragedy showed American ambition and vulnerability together. International students later studying engineering met the story in coursework. They saw how one nation's loss could reshape safety thinking. In the digital age, remembrance travels through messages and posts. On anniversaries, photos of the crew circulate with personal notes. People write about classrooms, Florida skies, about changing life directions. Younger readers encounter the story as a shared memory thread. From there, some seek deeper histories, testimonies, and technical explanations. Over time, the Challenger disaster has shaped ideas about heroism. Astronauts still represent courage, yet their images now include vulnerability. The crew appears in photos, but viewers know the ending. Honoring them means admiring bravery while demanding systems and oversight. In that balance, a more mature picture of exploration grows. Outside aerospace, many people use Challenger when weighing difficult decisions. They remember charts, cautions, and pressure, then ask questions themselves. Supervisors recall that managers reversed an engineer's plea for delay. Workers remember that silence felt safer than speaking until afterward. These echoes give the tragedy influence beyond rockets and laboratories. American stories often celebrate frontiers, inventions, and bold leaps forward. The Challenger disaster reminds storytellers to include doubts and costs. Biographies of astronauts describe training rooms and ethics briefings too. Histories of NASA place the accident near chapters on triumphs. In that weave, the space program feels more fully human. In Concord, New Hampshire, the story stays especially close today. Students walk the halls where Krista McAuliffe taught social studies. Her namesake center hosts programs on leadership, citizenship, and curiosity. Community events speak of her as teacher, neighbor, and inspiration. There, the mission feels less history and more neighborhood story. Across memorials, the diversity of the crew sends another message. Americans remember a physicist, an Asian American engineer, determined women. They see military pilots, civilians, and a teacher sharing mission. That mixture shapes how students picture who belongs in orbit. It hints that exploration widens when many people participate fully. Artists have folded the Challenger story into poems and paintings. Some works show clouds and contrails. Others focus on faces. Songs mention stars, classrooms, or the courage to try again. These pieces rarely dominate galleries, but they quietly extend remembrance. They help people feel the event rather than only analyze. Looking back, the Challenger disaster sits midway along spaceflight history. Before it came Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and unbroken upward momentum. After it came Redesign, Questions, Columbia, Retirement, and new rockets. Seen this way, the loss becomes turning point among several. Yet its nature means memory of that moment stays sharper. As decades pass, fewer adults remember watching the plume live. Children now meet the story like generations met Pearl Harbor. They learn dates, causes, voices, and the broad emotional outline. Personal recollections give way gradually to archives and organized commemorations. Yet questions remain, passed down with the sequence of events. Engineering programs treat the Challenger disaster as a central case. Students analyze memos, charts, and the famous late-night teleconference. Professors emphasize that ethics exist alongside equations, not underneath them. Guest speakers include former employees, now grey-haired, still passionate. Their presence makes the case study feel real, not abstract. Late at night, listeners replay recordings and interviews about Challenger. They hear steady voices, clipped phrases, and pauses before answers. The tone remains calm, yet the context makes it heartbreaking. Listeners often finish feeling saddened and strangely reassured by honesty. The story reminds them that acknowledging failure is an act. In the end, Challenger disaster memory belongs to everyone remembering. It belongs to those who learned later and still care. Together, they carry the crew's names, hopes, and journeys forward. Their remembering influences checklists, art, lessons, and quiet individual choices. In that sense, the crew still helps guide the country. On clear nights, someone looks up and thinks of Challenger. They imagine the arc of ascent, then the branching cloud. They breathe a little slowly and let their shoulders drop. They remember explorers' lives and lessons carried inside that loss. Then slowly, they let the story settle and fall quiet.